There is a country in the southern hemisphere that occupies an entire continent, is nearly as large as all of Europe, yet has a population the size of just one major Chinese city. And remarkably, in that vast, arid, and sparsely populated country, they have managed to build a public transportation system that is both astonishing and full of contradictions. Not the best in the world, not the worst, but right in the middle, exactly in the way its geography has destined it to be. This is the story of Australia, of its massive coastal cities, of the trams that were killed off in the mid-20th century, and of a lesson that a nation took decades to finally learn. This story begins not at a train station, but with the map itself. Because if you understand Australia's map, you will understand why their transportation system could not be like anyone else's. But first, let's consider a paradox. If you ask an American why the United States doesn't have good public transportation, the common answer is the country is too large and the population too sparse. And you know what? Australia is even larger, even sparser, yet it has significantly better public transportation. The question is, why? The answer lies in geography, but not in the way you might think. If you look at a map of Australia, the first thing you'll realise is that most of the land is uninhabitable. The interior is a vast desert, almost completely desolate. There is no water, no trees, nothing but sand and red rock stretching for thousands of kilometres. This is not a land where one can build cities or railways. As a result, Australia's entire population, nearly 28 million people, is concentrated in a narrow coastal strip in the east and the southwest. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, Canberra. Those 6 major cities contain up to 80% of the entire country's population. This is the key thing you need to understand. Australia's population is not evenly spread out. It clusters into enormous urban centres, separated by hundreds, even thousands of kilometres, with an empty desert in between. That's why the story of Australian transport is not about a national network, but about individual cities, each building its own system in its own way, and that creates some extremely interesting results. Before we dive into each city, let's ask a more fundamental question. In such a vast country, why does public transportation work at all? The short answer is, Australians don't spread out, they cluster together. And that clustering is a direct result of its geography. When 80% of the population lives in 6 major cities, and when each of those cities has a dense central business district, or CBD, public transportation naturally becomes viable. Because public transportation only works when many people need to go to the same place at the same time. And for Australians, that is exactly the case. This is completely different from the United States. After World War II, American cities experienced a phenomenon called white flight, where affluent residents moved to the suburbs, taking offices, workplaces, and shopping centres with them. As a result, jobs were no longer concentrated downtown, but became scattered everywhere. When jobs are dispersed, it becomes impossible to know where to run the train lines. Australia avoided this trap, not because they were smarter, but because their economy at the time wasn't large enough to finance the kind of urban sprawl seen in America. Being a little poorer can sometimes be a blessing in disguise. So, let's start with the largest city, Sydney. If you look at a map of Sydney, the city is located on Australia's east coast, built around a harbour so stunning it's called one of the most beautiful natural harbours in the world. But that beauty is also a geographical trap. Sydney Harbour divides the city into northern and southern halves, making the construction of transport infrastructure far more complex and expensive than in cities built on flat plains. Every railway line has to account for bridges, tunnels, and complex terrain. That's why Sydney's true subway network didn't arrive until 2019, becoming the first metro line in all of Australia. But here's the interesting part. For many decades prior, Sydney didn't need a metro in the traditional sense. They had a suburban rail network with 169 stations and nearly 920 kilometres of track that functioned like the metro system in other cities. Trains run from the distant suburbs into the city centre, passing through busy stations like Town Hall and Central, carrying hundreds of thousands of people each day. Every year, this system carries up to 270 million passengers. Not the figure of a sleepy city. This is a colossal transport machine at work every day, though it is not without its problems. And those problems became increasingly apparent as the city expanded. Key lines like the North Shore Line or the Western Line, which cross the Sydney Harbour Bridge, frequently reach capacity during peak hours. Can you imagine all of those trains having to funnel across a single bridge through a single tunnel? That very bottleneck was the real reason for building the metro. A metro isn't built because someone thinks of it. It's built because there's no other choice. The first metro line is 52 kilometers long, the third longest single automated line in the world, after Dubai and Malaysia. This is remarkable because it speaks to the scale of investment Sydney is making after its late start. During peak hours, trains run every 4 minutes, significantly easing the load on the older lines. And the work hasn't stopped. The rail line to the new airport in Western Sydney is under construction, promising to connect suburban areas that have been isolated for decades. But Sydney has an old wound, a wound that, to this day, has never quite been forgotten. In 1961, Sydney shut down its tram network. This was no small network. It was once the second largest tram network in the world. Let that number sink in. The second largest in the world. Behind only some cities in Europe and North America. Hundreds of kilometers of track, hundreds of trams carrying tens of millions of passengers each year. And then, within a post-war decade, it was all dismantled. The tracks were ripped up. The trams were sold off. The city filled in the tracks and paved them over. The official reason was to make way for cars. The real reason was far more complex, involving lobbying pressure from car and oil companies, a similar story that played out in dozens of cities around the world at the time. It wasn't until the early 21st century that Sydney rebuilt its tram network, with 58 stations and 50 kilometres of track across 4 lines, serving the city centre and inner city areas. This is the price of that wrong decision back in 1961. It took 40 years and billions of dollars to rebuild what once existed. Every tram that runs through central Sydney today is a quiet reminder that the city's geography was ready for it long ago. Only the people weren't. Now, let's move south along the coast to Melbourne. If Sydney is a city that grew organically, following its harbours and hillsides, then Melbourne is a city that was designed from scratch. In 1837, an architect named Robert Hoddle designed the street grid for Melbourne. He laid out very wide, straight main streets that intersected at right angles. Then, to facilitate commerce, smaller laneways were cut through the middle of the city blocks, allowing goods to be delivered from the rear of the buildings. This is why Melbourne has its famous laneway system, which has now become a tourist destination, densely packed with street art and cafes. But more importantly for our story today, those wide, straight, main streets were the perfect conditions for running trams. And Melbourne did exactly that. They built an extensive tram network, and when the wave of tram dismantling swept across the world in the mid-20th century, Melbourne was the only major Australian city that steadfastly refused to follow. The man behind that decision was Robert Risson, chairman of the Melbourne and Metropolitan Tramways Board from 1949 to 1970. For 2 decades, he resisted all pressure, all proposals to dismantle the trams to make way for cars. No one listened to him at first. Cars were the future, everyone said. But Risson did not yield. And when he left office in 1970, Melbourne had kept its trams. By the end of the century, while other cities were spending billions to rebuild what they once had, Melbourne simply had to continue operating what it never tore down. Today, the Melbourne tram network is the largest operational one in the world. 500 trams, 250 kilometres of track, 24 routes, and nearly 1,700 stops. For comparison, the tram network in Toronto, often called the largest in North America, is only 83 kilometres long. Melbourne's trams are not decorative pieces or tourist heritage. They carry over 150 million passengers a year. They are real transportation. And in the city centre, riding the tram is completely free, a policy rarely seen in any major metropolis in the world. But the trams only cover the central and inner city areas. To bring people from the distant suburbs into the city, Melbourne has a suburban rail network with 227 stations and 430 kilometres of track on 16 lines, the largest in Australia, carrying 182 million passengers per year. And here's the notable point. It all runs above ground. Nothing runs underground. It wasn't until February 2026 that Melbourne's first urban rail tunnel became fully operational. The Metro Tunnel, connecting South Kensington to South Yarra with 5 new underground stations beneath the city, is the solution to a problem that has been building for decades. Melbourne's 2 busiest lines, Cranbourne and Pakenham, had to run through the city centre, causing terrible congestion at Flinders Street Station, Australia's busiest station. By building a new underground corridor, Melbourne not only relieved those 2 lines, but also freed up capacity for all the remaining lines. The geography doesn't change, but people find a way to go underneath it. From Melbourne, if you head north, you reach Brisbane, Australia's 3rd largest city, and a place where the story gets interesting in a completely different way. Brisbane is a city of heat, of the winding Brisbane River, and of a different kind of geographical puzzle. This city sprawls horizontally at an alarming rate. Its population density is much lower than Sydney's or Melbourne's. The residential areas are elongated, dispersed, and not concentrated. This is a type of urban development that transport experts call sprawl, and it is a public transport nightmare. Because when people live everywhere, with no one near a train line or a tram stop, no network is dense enough to serve them all. And like Sydney, Brisbane once had a huge tram network, which carried 160 million passengers a year at its peak. Then, in the 1960s, like almost every other city, they tore it all down. But Brisbane's story doesn't end there. It ends somewhere more interesting. They replaced trams with buses and elevated buses to a level never seen before. The Brisbane Metro sounds like a subway, but it is actually a high-speed bus rapid transit system running entirely on dedicated lanes, completely separate from regular traffic. 50 articulated electric buses, each carrying 150 people, run on a 21-kilometre route with 18 stations along 2 lines. These are not ordinary buses. These are buses upgraded to nearly match a subway in terms of frequency and speed. But what's truly remarkable is the vast TransLink network underneath, with over 400 routes and 10,000 stops, covering the metropolitan area like a giant spider web. Brisbane chose buses as its backbone, not because buses are better than trains, but because, for its sprawling geography, buses are more flexible and less expensive to expand. This is an important lesson. There is no one-size-fits-all best solution. There are only solutions appropriate for the geography of each place. And Brisbane's fares are a testament to that. From 2024, following a trial period, all trips on the TransLink network will cost just 50 Australian cents each. This is an almost symbolic price, a clear message that the city considers public transport an essential service, not a source of revenue. Now let's move to the continent's west coast, to Perth. If you look at a map of Australia, Perth is in an extremely isolated position. It is the most remote major city in the world, in the absolute sense. The nearest major city, Adelaide, is over 2,000 kilometres away. And what's between Perth and Adelaide? Desert, sand, rock, nothing. This isolation creates a unique mentality. Perth has to fend for itself. It can't rely on other cities, can't share infrastructure, and can't benefit from economies of scale. As a result, they built their own system in a very interesting way. The Perth rail network consists of 8 lines with 86 stations and 244 kilometres of track. What's unique is that a large portion of the lines run along the median strips of freeways. It might sound strange, but it has its own logic. Freeways are often straight, creating ideal transport corridors, and by running trains in the median strip, noise is concentrated in a single corridor instead of spreading into residential areas. The downside, however, is that the stations are not located near people's homes, so they have to drive to the station. That's why buses play a special role here. With 42 out of 55 stations being bus-train interchanges, buses act as feeder services, drawing passengers from residential areas on either side of the freeway and transferring them to the trains. This model works so effectively that despite being only Australia's 4th largest city, Perth has the 3rd busiest suburban rail network in the country, with 62 million passenger trips per year. And Perth's fare system is the highlight of the entire story. Students travel for free from Monday to Friday. Everyone travels for free on Sundays. In the city centre, there is a free transit zone, where both buses and trains cost nothing. This is a level of subsidy that very few transport systems in the world achieve, and it proves that when a government wants people to stop using cars, they need to do more than just provide a service. They need to make that service so cheap, there is no reason not to use it. Finally, there is one thing Perth has not managed to do. Looking at the map, all the rail lines run out from the centre and radiate outwards, but no line connects them in a circle. If you want to travel from the northern suburbs to the southern suburbs without going through the centre, you have to go into the centre and then back out. This is an inherent flaw of a radial design, and solving it will be Perth's next major challenge. But the saddest part is not about Perth, Melbourne, Brisbane, or Sydney. It lies in a conclusion you draw after looking at the systems of all these cities as a whole. Let's look at the map of all of Australia one more time. Sydney has a huge train network, but started its metro too late. Melbourne has a great tram system, but will not have a subway tunnel until 2026. Brisbane replaced trams with buses because its geography was not suitable. Perth builds train lines on its freeways, but has no ring line. Adelaide, the fifth largest city, remains car dominant, with 84% of its people commuting by private vehicle. Each city bears the marks of decisions made half a century ago, when it was believed that the future belonged to the automobile. When railway lines were pulled up and tram networks dismantled, valuable land corridors disappeared forever under asphalt roads. To rebuild them, land must be repurchased, homes cleared, and billions of dollars spent on what was once free. This is the central paradox of today's story. Not a technical or economic paradox, but one of perception. People once thought that dismantling trams was progress, that the automobile was the future, that a vast country necessitated travel by car. But geography has proven otherwise. Cities that are populous enough, dense enough, and have enough common destinations will always need public transport, no matter how empty the surrounding country may be. Australia today continues to adjust. Sydney is building more metro lines. Melbourne has just opened a new tunnel. Brisbane is preparing to host the 2032 Olympic Games with a series of new infrastructure projects. And these projects aren't born from the remote desks of planners. They stem from the undeniable pressure of a geographical reality. When 28 million people are concentrated on a coastal strip, they must either move efficiently or suffer crippling congestion. Some things about geography cannot be changed. No one can move the sea, fill in the desert, or make Australia smaller. But there are things people can do. Learn from their mistakes, build systems suited to the land they inhabit, and remember that no single model is universally applicable. What works in Tokyo will not work in Perth. What works in Paris will not work in Brisbane. Geography sets the frame. People decide what goes inside it. Australia does not have the best transportation system in the world, but it has a system suited to the map it was dealt. And sometimes, that is all that can be done, and all that needs to be done,